For the first half of this semester, we talked about classical conditioning, and classical conditioning dealt with involuntary, reflexive, automatic behaviors that you don't have conscious control over. For the second half of the semester, we'll be discussing operant conditioning. And operant conditioning involves voluntary behaviors, behaviors that you do have conscious control over, behaviors that you choose to do or not to do. So we'll start off chapter 6 with a discussion of the historical background of operant conditioning. The two theorists that we most closely associate with operant conditioning are Edwin Thorndike and B.F. Skinner. So Thorndike performed the first experimental studies of operant conditioning in the 1890s. And Thorndike used the puzzle box, which we've discussed before, but I'll refresh your memory by showing you a picture of Thorndike's puzzle box. So Thorndike would place a cat in the puzzle box, and in that box there was like a little lever on the floor that the cat could press to be released from the box. So when the cat was first placed in the box, it would kind of make just random movements. It would hit the floor, paw at the walls, paw at the bars, until by accident it would hit the lever, the door would open, and the cat would be released. When the cat was again placed in the box with the door closed, those random movements, the pawing at the walls, at the floor, those movements decreased, and what did increase was the movement of pressing the lever. So the cat was much more likely to press the lever once placed in the box again so that it could be released from the box. So based on his observations of the cat in the puzzle box, Thorndike developed his law of effect. And this law says that behaviors leading to a satisfying state of affairs are strengthened, while behaviors that lead to an unsatisfying state of affairs are weakened. So because the cat found being released from the box to be satisfying, he found that to be a pleasant consequence, he increased the behavior of hitting the lever to be released from the box. And so if a behavior is followed by an unpleasant or an unsatisfying consequence, that behavior is less likely to happen again in the future. That behavior is weakened because the behavior is followed by an unsatisfying consequence. So Thorndike said that it is the consequences of a behavior that determine whether that behavior will be repeated again in the future. B.F. Skinner initially believed that most behaviors were reflexes. So if you remember from chapter 1 in the SR model, Skinner believed that there was some stimulus in the environment that led to an automatic behavioral response. So our behaviors were purely reflexes that were caused by some stimulus in the environment. And to do his experiments on operant conditioning, Skinner used a Skinner box, which was a plexiglass clear box, and he either placed a mouse or a pigeon inside the box. And so with mice, the mouse would have to press the lever, and if it pressed the lever, a food pellet was released into the box. With the pigeon had to peck at a key, which is like a little sort of disc on the wall, and the pigeon could peck at that key to have a food pellet released into the Skinner box. And so based on his work with animals in the Skinner box, Skinner altered Thorndike's law of effect by removing the descriptors satisfying state of affairs and unsatisfying state of affairs, because those terms required you to speculate about internal states. We can never really know what's satisfying or unsatisfying an organism. We have to make guesses about what's going on inside of them, and Skinner believed only in focusing on things that were observable. So rather than focusing on what was satisfying or unsatisfying, what the organism found pleasant or unpleasant, Skinner emphasized the effect of the consequence on the future probability of the behavior. So it was not whether the consequence was satisfying or unsatisfying that he focused on. It was purely how does that consequence affect the likelihood that that behavior will be repeated again in the future. So an organism emits a response, it shows a response, and the response is then followed by a consequence. and that consequence determines the probability that the behavior will occur again. Skinner said there are two types of consequences that can follow a behavior: reinforcement or punishment. Reinforcement increases or strengthens the behavior that it follows. Punishment decreases or weakens the behavior that it follows. Reinforcement and punishment are not about what the organism likes. It's purely about the effect of that consequence on behavior. So if I were to ask you, is candy a reinforcer or a punisher? And the answer to that is you really don't know. It doesn't matter whether the person likes candy or dislikes candy. You can only tell whether candy is a reinforcer by seeing the effect on behavior. If giving a person candy following a behavior increases the likelihood that that behavior will be shown in the future, then the candy acted as a reinforcer. If you give a person candy following a behavior and that behavior decreases in the future, the candy functioned as a punisher. So again, it's not about whether the person enjoys candy, whether they like candy. It's purely about how it affects behavior. So a good example of this is attention in the classroom. A student may be disruptive in the classroom and the teacher may yell at them, and they may intend for the yelling to act as a punisher and to decrease the disruptive behavior. But in fact, the yelling at the student may act as a reinforcer. It may increase the disruptive behavior. So even if the student doesn't necessarily like being yelled at, if they're yelled at, the behavior that it followed, if the disruptive behavior increases after the yelling acted as a reinforcer, even if the student didn't like it. So a reinforcer is anything that increases the behavior. A punisher is anything that decreases the behavior. Okay, so in our next lecture, we'll talk more about the application of reinforcement and punishment to operant behaviors.